I didn't raise my voice when the water started moving. I stood on the concrete lip of the spillway, boots planted firmly, hands tucked into my jacket pockets, watching the reservoir's surface change texture in that subtle way it does when gravity finally claims what it's owed. Behind me, the HOA president was still yelling, words sharp, frantic accusations about vandalism and criminal damage, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew how this moment would look from the outside. A calm man, an open gate, and water doing exactly what it has done for millions of years. What really mattered wasn't the noise behind me, or even the sound of the sluice gates adjusting under hydraulic pressure. It was the binder tucked tightly under my arm, thick with stamped documents, easements, and permits that no one on that board had bothered to read in decades. By the time the first calls started, coming in from the lower cul-de-sac, the decision had been made months ago. This wasn't rage. It wasn't the kind of revenge people imagine. It was inevitability finally catching up with arrogance. Before all this, my life out there was quiet, in a way you only learn to appreciate after you've lived without it for a long time. I moved to that property for the same reason a lot of people do when they're ready to stop fighting the world. I wanted space. I wanted routines that didn't include meetings, deadlines, or someone else's ego pressing down on my day. The land sat just outside a development that had grown aggressively over the past 10 years. Rows of uniform roofs, decorative stone, a place marketing itself as luxury living without ever explaining what that really meant beyond higher dues. My parcel was older. The house was older too, built back when the area had been more practical than pretty. It sat uphill from a man-made reservoir constructed in the 70s as part of a mixed-use water management project. Back then, the county had partnered with a private landowner to control seasonal runoff and reduce flooding downstream. The reservoir wasn't a decoration, it was infrastructure. Over time, developers wrapped homes around it, added walking paths, benches, and signage, and slowly started calling it a community water feature, as if changing the language could change its purpose. For me, it was simply part of the land I'd inherited stewardship over. I liked walking the perimeter in the mornings, especially in winter when the air was sharp and the water's surface looked like brushed steel. I kept a small wood pile stacked neatly near the shed, cut and seasoned months ahead because I'd learned the hard way that winter doesn't care how prepared you think you are. I had a routine: coffee before sunrise, a short walk, checking the gauges, splitting wood when the weather allowed, a silence that felt earned. I didn't attend HOA meetings because I wasn't part of the HOA. My deed made that clear. So did the county records. I wasn't anti-HOA on principle. I just didn't belong to that one. My property predated it, and the boundaries were unambiguous. I waved at neighbors when I saw them. I kept my place maintained. I stayed out of the way. That was the entire plan. The first sign someone else had a different plan came in the form of a laminated notice zip-tied to my front gate. It informed me I was in violation of community safety standards for storing excessive combustible material within view of common areas. The excessive combustible material was my winter woodpile on my land, behind my fence, barely visible unless you were standing at a very specific angle along the walking path. I remember reading it twice, not because it was confusing, but because I genuinely thought it had been misplaced. I assumed someone had the wrong address. I emailed the contact listed, politely explaining I wasn't an HOA member, that the woodpile was on my property and necessary for heating during the winter months. I attached a photo of my deed line, thinking that would clear it up. The response came 2 days later and ignored everything I'd said. It reiterated the violation and added that failure to comply could result in fines or corrective action. That phrase stuck with me. Corrective action is what people say when they want authority they don't actually have. Over the next few weeks, the notices multiplied. One cited my shed as non-compliant with aesthetic guidelines. Another accused me of obstructing views of The reservoir with unauthorized structures, meaning my firewood and the equipment I used to maintain the spillway intake screens. None of it made sense unless you started from the assumption the HOA president believed anything near the reservoir belonged to her by default. When I finally met her in person, it was clear that assumption had hardened into certainty. She showed. Up one afternoon while I was working near the lower gate, clipboard in hand, her smile tight, rehearsed, and carefully practiced. She informed me the board had decided I was misusing community land and that my activities posed a risk to residents downhill. I told her calmly that the reservoir and spillway were governed by a county-issued water management agreement, not HOA bylaws, and that my actions were permitted under that agreement. She didn't argue the facts. She dismissed them. Told me. The community had moved past those old documents. Said the board would be taking steps to protect homeowners. When I asked what that meant, she gestured vaguely and said they'd be in touch. They were. 2 weeks later, after a dry spell, I came down to the reservoir to find my woodpile charred and smoking. Someone had burned it. Not a campfire accident. Not a lightning strike. Deliberate. The sharp smell of accelerant was still in the air. Half my winter stockpile was gone in a blackened heap. The fire department had been called, of course, but by the time I arrived, it was out. No report was filed beyond discarded materials ignited. No suspects. The HOA president sent an email that evening reminding residents about unauthorized storage and thanking the board for swift action to reduce fire risk. That was the moment the tone inside me shifted, not to anger, but to clarity. Realized this wasn't about rules or safety or even control in the abstract. It was about narrative. As long as she could frame me as a problem, she could justify anything. And as long as people downhill believed the reservoir was a decorative amenity instead of regulated infrastructure, they'd cheer her on while she did it. That night, I pulled out the original land survey and started reading it line by line. After the fire, I tried to handle things the polite way for a little longer. Mostly out of habit, and partly because I wanted to be absolutely sure that, when this ended, it ended cleanly. I sent one more email to the HOA board. No emotion, no accusations, just facts. I documented the loss of my winter stockpile, attached photos taken minutes after the fire department cleared the scene, and asked directly if the board had authorized any action involving my property or the materials stored on it. I cited the county parcel number, easement language from my deed, and the section of state code defining willful destruction of private property. No threats, no hints, just a simple yes or no question. They never replied. Instead, they posted a notice on the community website about recent enforcement measures to ensure safety around the water feature, followed by a reminder urging residents to report any unauthorized activity near the reservoir. My name wasn't mentioned, but it didn't need to be. Neighbors I'd waved to for years stopped waving back. A woman I'd once helped shovel snow turned her back when she saw me at the mailbox. Rumors move faster than facts in places like this, and fear fills in whatever details are missing. The next escalation arrived by mail. A certified letter stating the HOA intended to install fencing along community-controlled shoreline areas, citing liability concerns. The enclosed map shaded in a section that overlapped my land by several feet, including the access path to the spillway controls. I read it slowly, then again, and felt that familiar tightening focus settle in. Blocking that access wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. The spillway wasn't decorative stonework, it was an active flood control system meant to be adjusted seasonally. Restricting access during winter runoff risked every house downhill. I requested a meeting, not an email exchange, not a hearing, but a real sit-down with the board and their attorney. I explained again that I was willing to walk them through the legal framework governing the reservoir and clarify any misunderstandings. Their reply arrived 2 days later, brief and smug. The board had already consulted counsel and my presence was not required. That was when I stopped trying to convince anyone who didn't want to understand. Evenings found me at the kitchen table. documents spread out in neat, deliberate stacks. Original deeds, amendments, county water management permits from the early 70s, yellowed but still legible, engineering diagrams showing inflow rates, spillway capacity, and emergency release protocols. I requested archived correspondence from the county clerk's office, letters between the original landowner and the planning commission that spelled out in plain language who was responsible for what and under which conditions. It took time. It took patience. More than once, a clerk called me back, saying they'd found something interesting buried in a file that hadn't been opened in years. What emerged wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine secrets. It was bureaucratic, boring, and devastatingly clear. The reservoir and spillway were governed by a standing agreement predating the HOA by nearly 30 years. While the HOA had limited maintenance access for cosmetic features added later, control over water levels, release mechanisms, and emergency operations remained with the landowner of record for the upstream parcel. That landowner was me. More importantly, the agreement explicitly prohibited obstruction of spillway access, citing downstream flood risk and liability. Violations carried significant civil penalties, not just for individuals, but for any organization attempting to interfere. I documented everything. Dates, notices were posted, photos of the burned woodpile, screenshots of HOA website language, copies of the fencing proposal. I logged interactions, noting times and locations, even when no words were exchanged. It wasn't paranoia, it was pattern recognition. People who rely on intimidation count on no one keeping track. My partner watched all of this with quiet concern. She never told me to stop, but her questions carried weight. What if they escalate further? What if someone gets hurt? What if the neighbors blame you? Those worries followed me into the night, especially during storms when the reservoir swelled, and the sound of rushing water reminded me why the controls existed. I slept lightly, listening, planning contingencies the way you do when responsibility isn't theoretical. The HOA's next move came just before the heavy rains. Contractors showed up unannounced one morning, staking out a fence line that cut directly across my access path. I approached calmly, asked who authorized the work, and informed them they were encroaching on private land and interfering with regulated infrastructure. They shrugged and pointed to the HOA work order. I told them to stop. They didn't. So I called the county. I kept it simple. No dramatics, no complaints. I asked to speak with the Water Resources Department and explained that an unauthorized party was attempting to obstruct a permitted spillway. The response on the other end shifted immediately. By afternoon, a county engineer stood beside me, examining the stakes, reviewing my documents, and taking notes. No raised voices, no threats needed. He issued a stop work order on the spot and warned the contractors that further work would risk fines for them and their client. That should have ended it. It didn't. The HOA president sent a community-wide email framing the incident as hostile interference with safety improvements, accusing me of endangering families and threatening legal action. She implied I was holding the neighborhood hostage over personal grievances. Reading it, I felt something close to sadness, not for myself, but for how thoroughly she misunderstood what was happening. She still thought she could win by shouting louder. By then, I had already scheduled my own meeting. The county requires an annual review of the reservoir operations plan, something that had become perfunctory over the years. I requested the review be held in person this time, citing recent interference. Notices went out inviting the county, the HOA, and nearby property owners. Attendance was optional, but I knew she wouldn't miss it. People like her never do. The night before, I stood by the spillway again. The water level sat just below the threshold where seasonal release becomes necessary. The forecast was clear. No emergency, no drama. Everything was operating exactly as designed. I thought about the woodpile that should have been stacked behind me, about winter nights made colder out of spite, and how small abuses compound when no one holds them in check. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. The binder under my arm was thicker now. The meeting room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. The HOA president arrived on time, wearing her usual tight smile, the kind that said she was convinced she was about to win yet. Another round. County officials sat beside me, nodding politely but watching closely. The other residents trickled in, curious but cautious. Some wore expressions that betrayed their doubt about the fuss all this had stirred. I didn't make a scene. I placed my binder on the table, opened it carefully, and began by reviewing the reservoir and Spillway's history in a tone as neutral and measured as a weather report. I spoke about the original land agreement, the public-private partnership that shaped the water management decades before the subdivision's luxury. Homes rose like silent sentinels around the water's edge. I explained how the HOA's recent actions violated clear stipulations in the deed and county code, highlighting the sections forbidding interference with spillway access and requiring all parties to maintain the system as designed. As I spoke, I noticed the HOA president shifting in her chair, her tight smile flickering and faltering for just a moment. When I pulled out the copy of the military reclamation order, an obscure but legally binding document tied to my family's ownership, the color drained from her face. Her lawyer, sitting beside her, glanced down at the pages, then back up. With a tight jaw and narrowed eyes, the room fell into a hush so complete it was almost reverent. No one spoke for longer than I expected. I watched as years of intimidation, false accusations, and petty harassment came crashing down, not with a shout, but with the quiet authority of cold, indisputable facts. When the county engineer finally spoke, his voice steady and clear, it became obvious where the meeting was heading. He summarized the technical details, confirming that any obstruction or unauthorized action on the spillway posed a direct flood risk, not just to me, but to every house downstream. He reminded everyone that liability extended to those who ignored the existing agreements. The HOA president opened her mouth to protest, but the lawyer's hand gently closed it before words could form. They requested a recess. During the break, I handed the attorney meticulously organized copies of every document I'd collected: deeds, permits, correspondence, photos. When the meeting reconvened, the president's tone was quieter, more uncertain. The board formally withdrew their fencing plan and the accusations related to my winter stockpile. They acknowledged the spillway and its controls remained under my jurisdiction, not theirs. The president offered no apology, but the message was unmistakable. Their hold over that part of the neighborhood's infrastructure was broken. In the weeks that followed, 2 board members resigned, citing personal reasons that conveniently aligned with the timing. The president herself stepped down soon after, her departure as silent as the meeting where her authority unraveled. The fines vanished, the notices stopped coming, and the neighborhood breathed easier. Life settled back into the quiet rhythm I'd sought when I first moved in. Neighbors began waving again, some sheepishly, others with genuine relief. I tended my property, used the spillway controls responsibly, and watched the seasons change without the shadow of petty retribution. I never sought revenge for its own sake. I simply refused to let ignorance and intimidation dictate how I lived, on my own land. Looking back, it's clear to me now that power built on fear is fragile. It doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be ready. And sometimes, being ready means quietly holding the facts, the law, and the truth, until the moment they can no longer be ignored.